Hi, I'm Femi Oke, and you're in the stream. This is the First Amendment of the US Constitution. Freedom of speech is perhaps one of the most venerated values in American life, but should there be limits to it?
And I'm Dan Ming. There's a growing debate over hate speech and free speech in the United States. Today we'll explore both sides happening in the streets and online.
Do not matter!
Those are just some of the types of rallying cries at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville earlier this month. Free speech is said to be one of the foundations of American democracy, fiercely protected by the First Amendment of the US Constitution. And it's because of this law that white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and other far-right groups were able to march through Charlottesville, displaying Nazi signs and symbols and shouting racial slurs after obtaining illegal permits. Hundreds of counter-protesters shouted opposing slogans, but when should lines between free speech and hate speech be drawn? Some activists say that a purist defense of free speech actually legitimizes racist views and allows hate groups to grow and spread their ideology. And the debate is intensifying. To help us explore both sides, we're joined by Ku Park, an attorney and critical race studies fellow at the UCLA School of Law.
Melina Abdullah is an organizer for Black Lives Matter and professor of Pan-African Studies at Cal University in Los Angeles. Harvey Silverglate is a civil liberties lawyer. And
Jeremy Malcolm is the Senior Global Policy Analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Hello, everybody. It's good to have you here. Melina, Ku, Harvey, Jeremy, in the last 2 weeks, you must have seen TV coverage of neo-Nazis saying things on TV, on the media. Was there anything that you heard, Harvey, that you should have been banned, where you heard that and you just said, that is just not acceptable? That is hate speech right there.
Well, first of all, the rally in Boston really didn't get going because the police shut it down in a terrible violation of First Amendment rights here in the States. So that didn't happen. It was squelched.
So that was the most recent one. That was just the one last weekend, and the rally officially was called a rally for free speech.
Yes, well, a rally for free speech didn't have much free speech. It had no speech. And in fact, I just want to start out in the beginning to say there is no such thing as hate speech under the First Amendment. Speech which says people who say I love you, they're free to say that. People who say I hate you are free to say that. Hate speech is not a separate category constitutionally in this country.
So in the First Amendment, Melina, you can say pretty much whatever you like. You have freedom of expression. The press can say what they like. You have freedom to practice your religion, freedom of assembly. So it gives you, as a citizen, the right to say what you like, almost do what you like in terms of what your religion is, where you gather.
Right, well, there's also the right of other people to hear. Remember that.
Melina?
Well, I would just say that, one, let me say I am not a civil liberties attorney. I'm a professor and an organizer. And I think that one of the things that it's really important to do is to not equate all people in this country. We do have an understanding that there are particular histories, particular experiences. What we saw happen in Charlottesville was rooted in a history of white supremacy. And so the notion that any group gets to do and say whatever it wants, and remember, it's not just the saying, it's also the doing, is something that we absolutely have to push back against. So when you have white supremacists not just saying chants, not just saying words that are offensive, not just retorting to Black Lives Matter organizers that Black lives don't matter, right? But actually marching with torches and armed to the hilt, right? And ready to really do something, as was demonstrated in Charlottesville, do violence to people, then those actions and that speech must not be protected. And the reason I'm distinguishing myself as not a civil liberties attorney, but rather a professor and an organizer, is that we also have to, kind of think about the difference between law and justice, right? Which sometimes come together and sometimes don't.
So going back to these definitional questions, Kay-Sue, I want to read you a tweet. We got this from Sharifa. She says, anything that targets, dehumanizes a person because of their color, race, or religion should be considered hate speech. Kay-Sue, is that how you would define hate speech?
I just want to clarify that the piece that I wrote for the New York Times about free speech really wasn't about what the scope of the First Amendment should be. I understand that people want to talk about it. I think it's an enormously important thing to talk about. I think it's a very tricky question. As lawyers, we do know that any tools that are available in the law can really be used for any side. This piece was more about legal advocacy and the choices that an organization such as the ACLU is going to make. It was an attempt to think through the other factors that impact speech as well as the limitations of the First Amendment. This is all a part of the landscape that an advocate considers when they're choosing clients. And I do think that had the ACLU been thinking about these questions, they might not have ended in a decision to represent the Unite the Right rally at Charlottesville.
And just for our international audience, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, let me tell you what they do. They're a non-partisan legal and advocacy organization devoted to protecting the rights of everyone in America. Are you struggling, Jeremy? Have you ever struggled with the line between free speech and hate speech?
Well, I'm actually Australian by birth, although I live and work in America. And I understand that there are different conceptions of what hate speech means. And I agree with the professor that there is no legal definition to hate speech in the United States. There's no such thing legally. Certainly under the First Amendment, hate speech is not a thing. We prefer to use the phrase hateful speech just to indicate that it's not a legal category of speech. The only category of speech under the First Amendment that might have been infringed by the neo-Nazi rally was speech that incited imminent violence, which is not protected by the First Amendment. But everything up to that point, including really derogatory, hateful expressions, is actually protected. So yes, there is a tension there. Not every country agrees that that's the right point at which to criminalize speech, but we found in the United States that has worked well in the sense that it safeguards a whole lot of differing views that we want to hear expressed in society, even if we may disagree with them.
So Jeremy, just to get to the rationale that underpins the United States' legal view of free speech, we have this tweet here from Namira. She writes, rationale is that in an open marketplace, good speech would drown out bad speech. Today, bad speech has millions of dollars amplifying it. So Melina, I want to pose that to you. Do you think that hate speech or discouraging discriminatory speech in the U.S. has a disproportionate platform right now?
Absolutely, and I thought that her framing of that was really, really important. It's important to understand that these radical folks on the right are heavily funded. And I mean, I think that we're starting to get some understanding of it when we think of people like Steve Bannon and others who have deep pockets and really wealthy supporters, right? What we're talking about is kind of a country that is rooted in white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative capitalism that is still funded by tremendous capital. And now they have a president in office who is probably the most problematic of the white supremacists, who's kind of egging them on, who's emboldening them, who's inciting them. And so, yeah, they have these platforms. When we think about what happened in Charlottesville, even what happened in Boston with the few folks who showed up for the so-called free speech rally, right? Those were funded actions. Where did they coordinate to purchase all those tiki torches? They're not free, right? We saw right here on my campus buses, luxury buses come in with, you know, my campus is 90% students of color. I'm at Cal State LA, 90% students of color. And just a year ago, we had a radical right-winger, Ben Shapiro, on this campus, and his entire audience was bussed in on luxury buses. And so that's vastly different from what's happening on the other side. When we talk about Black folks, brown folks, working class folks, LGBTQ folks, you're talking about a real grassroots movement that's not funded by people have deep pockets. Rather, it's regular people who decided that they were going to forego their morning coffee or bring lunch instead of buy lunch. And so it's imbalance in resources. And so that's absolutely something that we should consider, that free speech, their version of free speech, is not free speech, it's funded speech.
Harvey,
I think that it's just the opposite. That
Go ahead,
in the era of the internet, we all have access to massive communication opportunities. So I think what you were saying might have been true 15 years ago. It sure isn't true today.
Well, I think that's absolutely false. If you know how the internet works, you also know that you can boost posts, that there are dollars that go into having websites that get lots of hits. I know this because I do this, right? As Black Lives Matter, one of the things that we do is try to use the tools that are at our disposal, and the internet is absolutely one of them. Social media is one of them, but dollars are hugely important, and those who have the dollars are able to amplify their voices using the internet and using on-the-ground tactics.
Harvey, let me show you something here. This is from this weekend, for this weekend just gone. You mentioned the Boston Free Speech Rally. I want to take a little shot. It was a little shot that was taken from the counter-protesters, and then it goes across to the actual free speech protesters. Have a look at this. It's quite a remarkable difference between the counter-protesters and then this actually here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, is the free speech rally. Let me just pause it there. Is that not the epitome of free speech being allowed to thrive in the United States? There are a group of people who have one opinion, a group of people who have another opinion, is this something that's happening politically in the US, which is stifling free speech? How would you categorize this?
This rally never actually got off the ground because the people who were scheduled to speak were never allowed to speak.
Yeah.
Partly because the crowd was raucous and partly because the police kept the listeners too far away from the speakers. So this was a failure. This Boston experiment with speech was a huge failure. I hope that they try it again.
Let me just show you something else that has come up in the last 2 weeks. I'm going to show you a couple of comments on Twitter. This is from Marcus H. Johnson. The new thing white supremacists do is hide behind free speech. If black protesters were armed, you think they'd get the excuse?
Absolutely not. If black folks were walking down the street armed with guns, with body armor, we would not be allowed to move one moment. We'd be dead, right? And I think that that's another kind of something to point out, right, when we talk about what free speech is. Another way that these funds are used is those on the right are actually trained to pretend like they are victims of violence. So we see this time and time again when these folks like a Ben Shapiro or a Milo come to campuses. They come with a contingent of folks who are paid and who know how to angle their cell phones. And I didn't understand what was happening the first time I witnessed it. Throw themselves on the ground and pretend like they're being attacked. These are the things that happen in order to push a message that black folks are violent and that they are innocent victims. There'd be no way that Black Lives Matter protesters would be allowed to hide behind free speech, or even if we think about the Second Amendment arguments, right? If we think about the way in which black folks who legally carry guns, not even just in protest, if we think about, people like Philando Castile and people like John Crawford, who are legally engaging.
So Philando Castile, I'm just going to just help people out here as you're on a roll here, Melina. Philando Castile was an African-American man. He was stopped in his car. He said, I am carrying a gun in my car. He was shot dead. John Crawford was a young African-American man who was in a Walmart store. He had a toy BB gun, shot dead. All right,
by police, both
by the police. Yes.
Right.
I'd love to add something. I mean, I think what that last tweet brings up and what Melina's talking about is something that I tried to talk about in the op-ed that I wrote, which is that other other factors affect the ability to exercise speech, not just the First Amendment. Harvey, you yourself just said that that rally never got off the ground because of the actions of the police. I mean, I would say that the actions of the police have a lot to do with whether people have the ability to express themselves freely or not. And what we've seen in the media is a pattern of, for example, police arriving at Black Lives Matter protests in full military gear with tanks, full weaponry. No police were present in Charlottesville at the rally on Friday night. They didn't appear until the rally itself had disbanded, and then they moved to arrest counter-protesters. To me, this is a good example of the selective policing, a different institution impacting speech. This is an example of government suppression of speech that the First Amendment can't reach. You can't make that connection across space, across time. There are limitations to the protections the First Amendment can provide, and we're looking at a background where those factors are becoming increasingly dominant. Another good example to me of the limitations of the First Amendment, you have a candidate, Trump, in last October, who tells his supporters essentially to crack protesters' heads open. 10 months later, they do just that in Charlottesville. Is that government suppression of speech? I mean, I think to a broader audience, it certainly looks like a form of government suppression of speech. But again, the First Amendment can't reach that. Now, both of these factors were present in Charlottesville. And if I'm a legal advocate, I'm looking at this and despairing that my tools are so limited, so blunt, that there's nothing I can do about this. I'm trying to think of alternate ways that I can address the situation of a massive silencing of speech. Instead, I see the ACLU has chosen to take the case that more neatly fits a First Amendment pattern. In this case, it's to represent the Unite the Right group. I mean, I question that choice. I think if they were considering other background factors, they might not have reached that conclusion that it was necessary to do that.
So, Kesu, on this issue of the police presence, just jumping back to what you were saying just now, on the police presence at certain protests, take a look at my computer. This is a tweet from Black Lives Matter Louisville, and they're directing it to the mayor of their city. They said, "Can you explain why our peaceful march," this is a Black Lives Matter march, "is being met with this?" And you can see the police presence there. They're holding batons. Harvey, would you agree with what Kesu was saying earlier, that something like this could qualify as government suppression of free speech?
Sure it does. And the government suppresses on the left, the government suppresses on the right. The government doesn't like raucous demonstrations of speech. That's why we have a First Amendment, to restrain government censorship of speech.
Let me show you something here, Jeremy. This is from the Southern Law Poverty Center. It's a group in the United States that basically tracks hate groups. And currently they're looking at 917 hate groups. They are all over the United States. If we're in a situation right now where we're seeing a rise in people feeling very comfortable at saying, I'm a neo-Nazi, I'm a white supremacist, I want to go out and share my views on the street. What is the technique then for actually saying, how do we manage this as a country if we don't want these groups coming up and being seen more visible? What do you do?
The most important thing is to enforce the First Amendment, because if we don't do that, we don't know who the hate speech groups,
So you want to hear them, so you know where the hate's coming from. Huh? Jeremy?
If you don't let them talk,
I agree with this. On the other hand,
yeah, I hear you. Jeremy?
So I agree with this, but on the other hand, there are tools that we can use to manage things like harassment and people who are being fearful of threats that they may be receiving. And my organization's speciality is with internet-based speech, where we're not involved in discussions about the Second Amendment, that is the right to bear arms, or any sort of live protests, except to the extent that there are digital devices used to track protesters or those sorts of things. But when we're talking about internet speech, there are things that you can do to manage, like threatening speech that you're receiving. Most platforms do have a way for you to block or to mute certain people. And the right to free expression doesn't mean the right to force other people to listen to you. Other people are entitled to block you from their discussion groups, to just leave you out of their private conversations. That's perfectly fine. There's no free expression implications of that. I think we do have to worry about people, minorities in particular, who are feeling under threat, who are feeling unwelcome, and there are things that we can do about that without resorting to censorship.
So I'd like to.
I think it's really important that we understand that we're not just talking about speech, right? So we're having this theoretical conversation about people's right to express themselves and say what it is they want to say. I think most of us who are concerned about, you know, the rise of white supremacy in this country are not as concerned about what comes out of their mouths. I could care less if some random white guy says Black lives don't matter, right? My feelings are not really that hurt, right? And my feelings are not the most important thing, right? What we're looking at, though, is the coupling of speech with action. Right? And so when we see these kind of violent congregations that come together, that are armed, that led to the murder of a real person, right? That push and, you know, kind of intimidate people of color especially, that is where we need to draw the line. That is kind of something that we need to kind of step back and say, who are we as a country? Are we going to allow this to happen? Or are we going to protect people who need to be protected?
Melina,
this is not theory.
Melina, just on your point right now, we got this tweet here from Rosa. She says the white supremacists marching in Charlottesville, she's talking about, were not upholding the right to free speech. They were militarized, and their main goal was to inflict physical violence.
Absolutely.
So what do you make of the argument? What should be done there to prevent such violence? What are your recommendations?
Right. Well, we cannot allow that to happen. When we talk about what this speech incites, what these actions incite, and that was a tweet by the brilliant Rosa Clemente, who was a vice presidential candidate in 2008. But what this speech incites and what these actions incite are real physical dangers for Black folks, for brown folks, for working class folks, for everyone that they target. And so it's important that we as a community come together. I think that we're also making demands of our government and saying, you know, this veil of free speech is not more important than the safety of all people who reside in this country, and they have a duty to protect us.
Harvey?
But free speech is safety because it tells you where the dangerous people are. How are you going to know whom you should not turn your back on if you don't allow them to say something, even if it's very nasty?
I bet you wouldn't go out there. I bet you would have something to say if they came to your neighborhood and they said things like they were going to kill you or hurt you or your family members. You are living in theory. You are living in let me finish. You are living in theory. We're talking about the real lives of people like me and my children and my community.
I have had many death threats, I have to tell you, and I have appreciated the fact that the people were free to tell me that they wanted to kill me because that was very valuable self-preservation information. And censorship is not the way to save lives.
Harvey, but we have to add, though, you are saying this as an extremely experienced civil liberties lawyer. You literally lawyered up, so people can give you death threats and you know exactly how to deal with it. Average citizens, you can see why they would be terrified by that. Harvey?
I would be more terrified in a society where I didn't know who the haters were because they weren't even allowed to go out and parade and say it.
So there's a lot of things.
May I cut in?
Casey, go ahead.
May I cut in?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Quickly, right
I
at the
just
end of the
also
show.
want to. I mean, I think that it's right to ask the question about what the law should be, but the law is also one thing, and what advocates choose to do is another. I mean,
Casey, say it in a sentence. We're at the end of the show. Your last thought is what?
I don't think the Nazis are going to stop speaking just because the ACLU doesn't take their case. There are lots of other lawyers willing to do it. This movement is very loud. It's very prominent. I don't think that this is a real concern. I'm just trying to connect this conversation to reality. The reality is that a lot of communities in America don't feel free to speak. They don't feel that they have an equal access to speech. We've also had
Melina and Harvey and Jeremy also on this program. This is part one of our conversation about free speech and hate speech. In our next conversation, we're going online, talking about free speech and hate speech in the digital space and internationally. Thanks for watching, everybody.